Venom, noch schneller wie Metallica, noch brutaler wie Slayer, wie alle anderen. Das war einfach unser Konzept.
Titans of Teutonic Thrash, one of the greatest thrash metal bands, top 3, fucking easy. Alright, what I love about Sodom is just how direct and heavy-hitting their music is. And of course, creative mastermind Tom Angelripper's eviscerating voice, which at times kind of sounds like black and death metal vocals going over, hard-hitting thrash music. So, I mean, if that doesn't tickle your pickle, then click off this video, go search for the friggin' Sleep Token retrospective, okay, kid, you're done. Tom Angelripper started off as a young lad, working the mines in Gelsenkirchen. But like many great visionaries, Tom had a dream. He caught wind of what bands like Venom and Hellhammer were up to, and he wanted to push the music even farther, play it faster, play it heavier. So he sold his moped to buy a bass and an amp, and he got to work looking for bandmates. Initially, Tom found some useless fat to play on the drums.
Ich bin zum ersten Mal abgeholt und ich habe mich total erschrocken, wo ich den ersten Mal gesehen habe. Oh, ich denke, das kann nicht wahr sein. Also er war sehr übergewichtig.
Before he shacked up with fellow alcoholic Chris Witchhunter. Now, I'm a drummer, and I'm a huge admirer of the way that Chris Witchhunter plays. He just has unrelenting speed, and he hits harder than Joe Jackson when the Jackson 5 sang out of key. As much as I love Chris Witchhunter's playing, it seems like he was a pretty difficult person to get along with, which is why Sodom go through guitar players like Khloe Kardashian goes through NBA players. And in their early days, Sodom had a reputation for being a chaotic band that liked having a few refreshments.
Irgendwie gut eingetrunken und dabei mit dem Bass alles kurz und klein geschlagen. Das war ziemlich witzig gewesen. Sagte, da stand ich neben dem Tommy, da stand der Mischpult. Wie ist der denn drauf? Der Angelripper, wie ist der denn drauf? Haut mir den ganzen Proberaum kaputt. Oh Gottes Willen, die Scheiße, das geht doch nicht. Bleib mal ruhig, der beruhigt sich ja wieder.
The underground publications caught wind of their demos and thought this band was the next big thing, the heaviest, most aggressive music ever. A lot of the more mainstream music critics were like, what the fuck is this crap? This shit sucks.
Gesagt haben, die Band ist so scheiße, die muss man unter Vertrag nehmen. Das habe ich natürlich nie gesagt. Sondern die Wahrheit ist, ich habe gesagt, die Band ist so scheiße, die muss viel verkaufen. Das ist ein großer Unterschied.
Eventually, the band would settle down with the first guitar player who actually matters, in my opinion, Grave Violator. And that is because he would be the man who would round out the Sodom lineup for their debut effort. Not an album, but an EP, which would prove to be an immortal and pioneering effort for not just one, but 2 genres.
Eine Plattenfirma von SBV im Studio wollte mal nach dem Rechten gucken und wir haben mal kurz in die Bänder reingehört, der hat nur die Hände über den Kopf zusammengeschlagen, was wir jetzt daraus überhaupt gemacht haben. Der war völlig entsetzt, ich weiß gar nicht, ob der CD.
This intro EP is often classified as first wave black metal. It's given that classification given its speed and, more importantly, Angelripper's ghastly voice. I mean, the man sounds like a demon from hell! And credit to drummer Chris Witchhunter, who is showing off unreal speed on this album, especially by 1984 standards, but also shows some impressive dexterity with some of his drum fills as well. The playing may be a bit sloppy at times on this record, but nobody was touching the tempos these guys were at the time. And Grave Violator's finest moment, to me, comes on the song Witching Metal, where he lays down some super reverb-drenched lead guitar solos. Overall, this EP is fast, heavy, and evil, but it is still musical, like in the sense that these riffs are catchy and memorable and not just, mindless speed for speed's sake. The lyrics deal with themes of heresy, Satan, the occult, and other nice things, which of course was another influence towards the burgeoning black metal subgenre. And this EP ended up selling pretty well, and kind of helped gain Sodom some notoriety in the German thrash metal scene. And in the eyes of the record label, Sodom passed the test.
Obsessed by Cruelty ist das erste richtig vollwertige Sodom-Album. Und dann kam wieder ein Repräsentant von der Plattenfirma, der sich das Ding angehört hat, gesagt, das können wir so nicht rausbringen. Also der Sound war grottenschlecht.
Not even after one album, just one EP, and Great Violator was already out of the band because he couldn't really get along with Tom and Chris. That is going to be a recurring theme throughout this video. So Great Violator would be succeeded by guitarist Destructor. And one thing that I do not understand about this album is that I assume you got a bigger budget, to work with to make a fully fledged album, but this sounds way worse than the intro EP that they did. How the hell does that even happen? It sounds sloppier. The guitar sounds like it's running through a microwave instead of an amp. And the label noted as much. When they first heard the band's effort, they were like, what the fuck is this? Go back and do it right. So, the band did a second version of the album, re-recorded it. When it was time to distribute the album, they sent the initial crap recording over to America, and then the second, more refined version was more widely distributed in Germany. Now, these two albums actually sound completely different, according to Tom Angelripper, and the second version, the more refined version, has the track After the Deluge on it, so that's how you can know which version you got. But despite sounding like a sonic abortion, this album would actually be very influential to the burgeoning Norwegian black metal scene, with famous photographer and stabbing victim Euronymous of the band Mayhem. He actually decided to name his record label after one of the songs on this album, Deathlike Silence. And even as influential as this album is, I still feel like it is a bit of a sophomore slump, because I just feel like overall the songs are just not as strong as they were on In the Sign of Evil. That's not to say this is a bad album, alright? Sodom doesn't do bad albums. As far as the deep cut diamond for this album goes, I would say Pretenders to the Throne is my pick. And in typical Sodom fashion, after they recorded this album, Destructor would leave the band. Now, from what I can gather, Destructor is kind of an introverted guy, liked to keep to himself, whereas Tom and Chris were wild drunks that loved to party and tear shit up all the time, so I imagine there was somewhat of a vibe mismatch between them. But then Sodom would add the legendary Frank Blackfire on guitar. And Frank would record a 3-track EP with the band shortly after this album called Exposure of Sodomy. And what it lacks in runtime, it more than makes up for in impact and production value. While not super pristine, this EP is definitely a lot more listenable than Obsessed by Cruelty. And it would be, in my opinion, Sodom's last foray into black metal, or at least black and thrash metal. And this EP has some really cool songs, including Sodomy and Lust, which is a song about hanging out with Rob Halford backstage. Sodomy and Lust. While this was Frank Blackfire's debut with the band, his legend would really start to grow due to his contributions on the next release.
Wir wollten ja auch ein bisschen weg von diesem ganzen satanischen Image aller Obsessed by Cruelty in the Sound of Evil. Wollten halt mal ein bisschen was anderes machen, und Frank hatte eigentlich das technische Know-how, er hatte überhaupt das Potenzial dazu, gute Songs zu schreiben.
With Frank Blackfire's songwriting ability mixed with producer Harris Johns, who the band would start working with in this album and would continue to work with him on other albums, with that combination, they were able to fully realize their thrash vision. You've got guitars that actually sound like they're running through an amp. You have Tom Angelripper's snarl and his distorted bass tone that just give this album such a gritty edge. And Witchhunter's drumming is super tight. And some of these songs are played at like 230 BPM, so being able to keep up with those tempos is really impressive. And this album opens up with possibly the greatest Sodom song ever written, Nuclear Winter. I think what makes the songs on this album so memorable is how they're able to blend the super fast thrash riffs with more kind of groovy headbanging riffs as well. You know, songs like Electrocution, the title track, Christ Passion, and one of my favorites of the bunch, Enchanted Land. And then on the album closer, you've got a German lyric, kind of punk-sounding song by the name of Bombenhagel, which would start a somewhat tradition. They didn't do it on every album, but they do it pretty often, where they put one German lyric, very punk-sounding song on the album. And this song would get the band into some controversy, because, you know, it's got German lyrics, and then you hear the German national anthem is played somewhere in that song. And so people were accusing Sodom of being like right-wing nationalists and stuff like that, which is pretty ridiculous, because Tom Angelripper himself says that he doesn't really consider himself to be super politically active. You know, he's generally against war. He'd rather just everyone else got along. You know, quite frankly, I think the only thing Angelripper really cares about is the right to get sloshed. Also, real quick, just realized, forgot to show my copy of the album, so there we go, Persecution Mania.
Top 75. Ja. Sodom auf 36. Das war richtig eine Sensation, gerade in diesem Genre. Es gab zuvor nicht eine einzige Thrash-Metal-Band, die die Charts erreicht hatte. Sondern niemals Slayer etc.
For the first time in Sodom's young history, they would actually retain a guitar player for more than one album, and Frank Blackfire would polish Sodom's songwriting even further with 1989's Agent Orange. And one quick thing that I think is cool about this CD, this is an older copy, and it says made in West Germany, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. I don't know, I just think stuff like that is neat. This album is Sodom's most popular and well-known release, and I think the reason for that is that I feel like these songs are just kind of a bit more accessible and catchy than their previous work. You know, there are still elements of aggression in the music, but it seems like these songs are a bit more musical than going for just like straight up fury. You know, see for example the title track, and of course, Remember the Fallen. Remember the Fallen. You got other catchier tracks like Tired and Red, which does start off pretty fast but has an acoustic interlude and kind of closes out with some groovier riffs. But my favorite song on the album has got to be Magic Dragon, because Witchhunter's snare just has this absolute spine-shattering snap to it, and I just love that really fast pre-chorus or chorus section. This album still has some Persecution Mania-esque scorchers, coming from songs like Exhibition Bout and the family-friendly track Incest. And the German punk song on this album would be the mighty Ausgebombt, which would be the first song that Sodom did a music video for. But unfortunately, after recording this album, Frank Blackfire would leave the band because he wasn't getting along with Tom and Chris. Who could have seen something like this coming? How could this have happened? They found a permanent replacement for Blackfire with guitarist Michael Hoffman.
Ist es schon außen ist mit Sicherheit nicht die beste oder die härteste Solo-Platte, aber Bed of Dead ist für mich was ganz Besonderes, vor allem Musik.
Dead is a good Sodom album. I don't think it's as special as Persecution Mania or Agent Orange or some other albums that are yet to come, but it is solid. You know, my main issue I guess I have with the album is that I think the production makes the band sound a bit tame. The songs are good, there's no issue with the songs themselves. The album opens up with An Eye for an Eye, which will thrash you around harder than Ray Rice did to his fiancée in the elevator. Shellfire Defense features Tom doing some like Cliff Burton-esque wah pedal stuff that rules. The big hit from this album would be The Saw is the Law, inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. Songs like Blood Trails get kind of funky at times, and another song to note is the deep cut Resurrection, which is a song that Tom Angelripper wrote for his father, who had recently passed away while they were working on this album. But the big thing with this album for Sodom is all the different kinds of tours they would start to go on. You know, they went to Japan for the first time. They were the first Western metal band to play a show in the Soviet Union. I think it was in Sofia, Hungary. And it was one of the biggest shows that Sodom has ever played. They played to a crowd of like 15,000 people. And while they were doing all these tours, they would sometimes run into some mishaps, like when they left Tom stranded at the Austrian border.
Jetzt steht Tom auf in Unterhose und Schlappen und geht zu Pinkeln. Und keiner merkt, dass raus ist.
Und der Bus war weg. Jetzt habe ich natürlich gesagt, klar, ist so ein kleiner Tourscherz. Nach 10 Minuten kommt der Bus wieder. Nach 12 Stunden habe ich gesagt, jetzt ist es aber soweit, jetzt könnte der Bus tatsächlich wiederkommen. Es war auch schon mitten in der Nacht oder so. Ich stand da ohne Klamotten, ohne Geld, ohne Portemonnaie, Handy gab es ja damals noch nicht. Sagte, versuch doch einen LKW-Fahrer anzuheuern, den ich dann zur Grenze bringt und so. Ich sagte, ja, die meisten LKW-Fahrer, wenn ich sage, ich muss 800 Kilometer zur ungarischen Grenze fahren, die wollen ja auch Kohle sehen. Also so einfach nehmen sie mich an die Miete. Außer das wäre Schwule gewesen, aber da habe ich keinen Bock drauf gehabt.
And the band would visit South America for the first time, which would prove to be a blessing and a curse. A blessing in the sense that, you know, you're visiting a new country, you know, playing shows, having a good time. But a bit of a curse in the sense that guitarist Michael Hoffman, while he was down in Brazil, ended up meeting a Brazilian baddie that would turn out to eventually become his wife. And so he acquired a studio down in Brazil, and he told the guys, look, man, I'm staying here. I ain't going back to Germany. You know, he did offer the band that they could record at his studio, but, you know, given that the logistical challenges of going back and forth between Germany and Brazil, you know, the band actually amicably parted ways with Michael Hoffman. But once again, Sodom had to find another guitar player. And this time they would recruit 20-year-old Andy Briggs, who would prove to be a shot in the arm for the band. But as we know, in order to give yourself a shot in the arm, first, you need to tap the vein.
Dem Andy, da kam so eine frische Brise rein. Wir haben einfach eine kurze Zeit viele Stücke gemacht, es hat geknallt wie die Pest und wir haben sie einfach so aufgenommen. Einfach so, wie wir Lust drauf hatten. Ziemlich energiegeladen mit viel Druck, volle Kanne.
Now we are talking. Now we are talking. Alright, Persecution Mania is probably my favorite Sodom album, but Tap in the Vein is not too far behind. If you thought Sodom sounded tame on the last album, they sound absolutely unhinged on this one. This album has a great sound. It was actually Sodom's most expensive production, but it doesn't sound overproduced at all. It sounds perfectly produced. Angelripper's vocals are the most visceral they've ever been, bordering on death metal. And Andy Briggs' guitar playing is just absolutely manic. Unreal speed on tracks like Body Parts and Skinned Alive, where the guy plays so fast, I don't know how his strings aren't melting. And this album is drummer Chris Witchhunter's finest hour in Sodom. You know, he first started off playing drums as a kid who could barely keep time, to really reaching an impressive technical level of drumming ability, you know, especially songs on Deadline showing off some intricate fills and some wicked double bass speed. He even contributed lyrics to some of the best songs on the album, like album opener Body Parts, and of course the epic The Crippler, which is just a brutal song about being a gladiator. I will break your spine. Although not everything on this album is played at the tempo of a machine gun, the epic album closer Reincarnation has got a great headbanging riff played at a pretty comfortable tempo, even has some clean guitars mixed in there. Best groovy song, arguably the best song on the album, of course, is One Step. This album also does have a couple like punk sounding songs like Bullet in the Head, which comes to mind, and the return of the German lyric punk song Wachturm.
Mitten in der Nacht, es klingelt an der Tür. Doch halt die Kurve, das glaubt mir keiner, da will jemand was von mir.
But as with a lot of things in life, you really can't have shit. Because when Witchhunter was at the peak of his powers, he got fired from the band.
Die Japan-Tour war ein absoluter Erfolg für die Band, aber wir haben gemerkt, dass es Probleme gab mit Chris in der Band. Wir haben nicht mehr miteinander kommuniziert und ich hatte schon den Eindruck, ich glaube sogar Chris selber, dass er eigentlich nicht mehr so in die Band reinpasste, allein durch die vielen persönlichen Probleme, die er hatte.
Wo mich Tom Angelripper rausgeschmissen hat, werde ich nie vergessen.
Jetzt tust du so, als wenn ich ausgestiegen bin. Du hast mich rausgeschmissen mit dem Prinks. Das weißt du doch.
Ich schlag gleich die Kamera kaputt. Jetzt könnt ihr mich am Arsch lecken. Kein Wort mehr.
And it would be Atomic Steiff, formerly of Living Death and Holy Moses, who would step in to fill those big shoes.
Ich habe auch gemerkt, dass wir unwahrscheinlich gut zusammenarbeiten, dass wir uns unwahrscheinlich gut verstehen. Man braucht manchmal gar nicht viel zu reden, um einen Song zu schreiben. Ja? Wir haben Andi kam mit dem Gitarrenriff und Steiff ist sofort eingestiegen, der Bass rein. Die Texte waren auch relativ schnell fertig. Wir haben fast bei jeder Probe einen Titel geschrieben.
First of all, probably the worst album art that I've ever seen in my life. Arguably the worst album art in the band's discography, but unfortunately it is debatable. But we'll get to that later. This album would mark a change in direction for Sodom's sound, where it's a lot less thrashy sounding and a lot more kind of hardcore punky sounding. The album has a more raw and stripped down kind of sound because the band decided to record this album without any overdubs. Just one guitar track, one bass track, one drum track, one vocal track. I think a lot of people skimp over this album because of the atrocious album artwork, you know, the change in direction from thrash to more punky sounds. And this album came out during the dark ages of heavy and thrash metal, aka the commercial peak of grunge. But at the same time, Sodom has had a habit of releasing like one or two punky songs on all their albums, so you could kind of just think of this album just being an album full of Sodom's just like punky songs that they've done on other previous albums. The songs that I really like on this album, I would say, are the title track, Job of the Hut, Eat Me, and of course the song that they did a music video for, Silence is Consent. A song about, you know, how you shouldn't be killing whales and overfishing and all that stuff, and how if you don't say anything about it, you're just letting it happen. Now this may come as a shock to you, but after recording this album, Sodom would once again part ways with their guitarist. And from what I've gathered, you know, Andy was like 23 at the time and Tom was in his 30s, so I think there was just, you know, that age gap had a bit of a vibe mismatch and stuff like that. And Tom Angelripper, when he describes firing Andy, he says that he kind of made the decision hastily and he kind of regrets the way that it went down. But whatever. He was out of the band and they would bring in new guitarist Strahli.
Nicht in dem Sinne produziert, sondern produziert haben eigentlich wir.
So that's why this album sounds the way that it does. You know, a lot of people complain that the production on this album is very muddy and they don't really like how the bass sounds. But I actually kind of like it a little bit. Atomic Steiff's drums sound really great. I mean, that snare cuts through the mix like an emo chick. And I don't know, I kind of like how this album sounds. You know, I listen to a lot of black metal, so, you know, by my standards, the production on this sounds just like Sgt. Pepper's. But as far as the songs themselves go, a lot of critics of this album will say that these songs are mediocre at best. And I will concede there are definitely a handful of tracks throughout this album that meet that criteria. But some people crucify this album online as if it's Sodom's Saint Anger. And I think that's bang out of order. This definitely isn't the best Sodom album ever, alright? And even if it is the worst Sodom, which it probably is, it's still pretty decent, alright? A bad Sodom album is still, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty decent album. You know, it may have some filler tracks on it, but the Downfall Network is a BBL safe space, ladies. But the songs that hit on this album make me want to xenomorph into a gorilla and just tear shit up. Other tracks like Fields of Honor has a pretty cool melodic chorus. You got some deep cut gems like Scum and Hydrophobia. But my favorite song on the album is honestly probably just the title track, because it's got riffs that just make you feel like you're getting jumped by a gang of hooligans. Shortly after recording this album, guitarist Strahli would get into some legal trouble, would go to jail, hence why he was out of the band. For once, it's not because he couldn't get along with Tom. You know, Tom actually really liked Strahli. But someone who was not getting along with Tom was drummer Atomic Steiff, which I don't know if it was for personal reasons, musical reasons, business-wise, it's not entirely clear. But he just couldn't find any common ground with Tom, so basically he went Splitsville on the band. And Tom felt like this was kind of a low point in his career with Sodom. You know, he wasn't really happy with the constant flux of members in and out of the band, so he decided to put Sodom on pause, and he started doing this solo project under the moniker of Uncle Tom, where he was basically just doing like German drinking songs, but like making metal versions of them. Now, I'm not going to cover the Uncle Tom albums because this is a Sodom retrospective, but I do mention that because while Tom was at the studio recording for Uncle Tom, there was another band called Randalica that was recording there as well, and it would be their drummer named Bobby Tom would shack up with, and he would eventually become Sodom's drummer. Now they just needed to find a guitar player, and it turns out Bobby knew a guy named Bernemann. And the band would jam together. You know, it wasn't strictly that they were reforming Sodom, but, you know, Tom was like, all right, let's jam, let's see how it works out. And the chemistry and the vibes are just so good. Tom was like, you know what? We're reforming Sodom with this lineup. So let's see how they would do.
Auch heute, wenn ich die Scheibe höre ich immer noch sehr gerne die Till Death, weil es einfach sehr frisch ist. Wir haben uns da keinen großen Kopf gemacht, wir haben einfach drauf losgespielt.
Es war diese Punk-Einflüsse, die uns da immer nachgesagt werden, meine Till Death, was die kann ich schon nachvollziehen, aber Kritik daran kann ich nicht akzeptieren.
Of the Sodom hardcore era of albums, I think this one is definitely the best. But as far as album covers go, probably the worst. I literally avoided listening to this album because of the album artwork. But, you know, I listened to this album to make this retrospective, and I was like, man, like, this album's production is great, the guitar tone is great, the drums sound great, and, like, these songs rule! The big hit off of this album is the hardcore cover of NWA's classic, Fuck the Police. I think this album has a blend of the hardcore sound and the thrash metal sound, at least to my ears. You know, the album opener, Frozen Screams, is a ripping scorcher, you know, a riff that just sounds like two machine guns being fired off at once. You got the Inquisition-ass song title of What an Unknown Killer Diarized. Is diarized even a word? You know, who cares? Because, you know, Will Shakespeare used to, like, make up words. He invented, what, like 600 words? Like, if Bill Shakespeare can do it, I don't see why Tom Angelripper can't just make up words, too. I think he's earned the right. Although my favorite song on the album is probably the kick-ass No Way Out. And the B-side of this album doesn't slack off either. You got the punky Master of Disguise, and the second to last song, Schwerter zu Pflugscharen. But my favorite song from the B-side has got to be Wander in the Valley. I mean, come on, people. These riffs will give you chest hairs. After recording this album, Angelripper got the boys together. You know, he paused dramatically, and he said, all right, boys, it's time to stop fucking around. I'm Tom Angelripper. We're Sodom. We're thrash metal legends.
Did you order the code red?
I did the job. Did you order the code red? You're goddamn right I did!
Through my eyes and see the wisdom strong above. Execution of my mind and scrambled symbols all around. Born to be a man who has no nature in the
Scheibe, die sollte definitiv nicht so punkig ausfahren. Wir wollten also ein bisschen mehr back to the roots.
Sprich Persecution, Mania, Agent Orange. Und das kam Bernie und mir eigentlich auch wirklich wie von der Seele gesprochen, als Tom sagte, irgendwie er möchte diesen punkigen Einschlag eigentlich nicht mehr haben.
The new guys were fans of the old Sodom records, so Tom making the adjustment from hardcore to thrash was pretty seamless. I feel like the songs on this album kind of invoke the Agent Orange / Tapping the Vein era of the band. You know, you got a decent mix of kick-ass groovy songs a la Agent Orange, and a lot of scorchers played at Tapping the Vein tempos. Code Red and What Hell Can Create eviscerate you from the jump. Bobby showing that he can keep pace with Witchhunter tempos, and Bernemann showing off his technical prowess. But it's not just about pure speed. These songs are a lot more memorable and, in my opinion, more coherent. You know, some of the hardcore albums, those songs were just kind of a bit aimless. Like, they had some riffs that were decent, but they kind of just went nowhere. Best song on the album is a groovier one, Tombstone, and you cannot tell me that that chorus is not one of the most badass in all of Sodom's discography. The B-side also has some bangers. You know, you got the super riffy Cowardice, you got the last-minute edition of Addicted to Abstinence, which the band wrote when they realized the album wasn't 40 minutes, and that song's got like a Motorhead vibe to it. But my favorite of the B-sides is the absolutely savage Book Burning. This album was very well received by fans and critics alike, who kind of viewed it as the rebirth of classic Sodom. And as many of you know, a lot of wayward heavy and thrash metal bands around the turn of the millennium were starting to go back to their roots. But Sodom was ahead of the curve on all of these sucking MCs. Code Red came out in 1999. Angelripper is just a trailblazer without even trying. He ended up pioneering first wave black metal just because he wanted to get sloshed with the boys and play super fast. Then he ended up pioneering the 2000s thrash metal comeback because he got sloshed with the boys and just wanted to play super fast.
Umso besser fand ich es, dass wir dann zu den Proben zu M16 uns überhaupt nichts vorgenommen haben. Wir haben jetzt nicht gesagt, wir wollen nochmal Code Red machen oder nochmal Agent Orange, sondern wir haben einfach nur gesagt, lass uns ein Sodom-Album machen.
For Sodom's next trick, they would return to the topic of the Vietnam War. Something Angelripper has always been fascinated by, and something that they did, you know, touch a little bit on Agent Orange. I mean, you know, the title of that album is the famous herbicide the U.S. military used to try and clear out all the jungle in Vietnam. But then that herbicide got mixed in with the water supply, and then that led local children having birth defects and all that. The band actually even visited Vietnam around the time they were making this album.
Ich möchte nicht wissen, wenn wir das komplette Songwriting nach dieser Erfahrung gemacht hätten, wie das ausgefallen wäre.
Das hat Tom, glaube ich, auch nochmal einen Anstoß gegeben, nochmal einige Texte nochmal zu überarbeiten.
Dann nochmal Dinge ins richtige Licht zu rücken.
Es reicht ja nicht, wenn man Filme guckt oder...
This album is another fan favorite and one that is also considered part of like the classic thrash revival of the early 2000s. Although I don't think this album is actually all that thrashy. To me, it's a bit more like groove and kind of riff-oriented, kind of in a similar vein to like Sepultura's Chaos AD. And I think it's funny that Chaos AD gets maligned for having more like kind of groove metal elements, while this album is held up as like a modern-day classic. And I don't say that to slander this album. I like this album a lot. I'm just pointing it out. Take, for example, one of the fan favorites off this album, Napalm in the Morning, which has a shuffle groove to it and like a really, really catchy chorus.
Smells like victory.
Napalm in the morning.
You got some other really cool groovy songs like the title track M16 and Genocide. No offense to Rwanda, but you do also still have some thrashy songs. You know, Mind Jumper comes to mind, as well as I Am the War. which has a great double bass groove in the chorus and just super fast riffing throughout. But my favorite song on the album is the second to last song, and what probably should have been the album closer, although this album closes with a cover of Surfin' Bird that goes about as well as Puddle of Mud's cover of About a Girl. Just the less said about it, the better. But the second to last song should have been closing track, Marines. A song that I once listened to like 50 times in a row because I love those riffs, and I think Tom Angelripper's vocal delivery is super badass.
And from my brothers, you'll get what you deserve. Down the bloody road to war.
Das ist das 4. Album in Folge, wo wir anscheinend einen draufsetzen konnten. Und wieder ein völlig anderes Album.
Wir wollen natürlich nicht moderner klingen, wir wollen halt besser klingen vom Sound her. Die Technik hat sich weiterentwickelt, wir haben uns weiter.
So why make a self-titled album 20 years into your career? Well, as Tom said, every band has one, so we just figured why not do it now. And instead of longtime producer Harris Johns working with the band, it would be their former guitar player, Andy Briggs, who would be calling the shots behind the mixing board. Which is kind of interesting because after he got kicked out of Sodom, Andy said that he hated Angelripper for about 5 to 8 years, but I guess they made up, possibly made out, and now they were working together again. One thing that Angelripper said that he liked about working with Andy is that since they were on stage together, Andy knew what Angelripper's strengths were and what he was capable of, so he's really able to squeeze all the juice out of Angelripper's performances for this album. And I'd say the album sound is pretty good for the most part. I mean, if I am being nitpicky, I would say the guitars sound a little bit too tame, which is like, come on Andy, you played on Tap in the Vein. Just use that guitar tone. But outside of that nitpick, I think the drums sound good. I think Angelripper's vocals sound really good. And this album has Sodom doing some kind of different songs. Buried in the Justice Ground, which I have no idea what that title means. But it's like a mid-tempo groovy track that sounds more like a rock song than a thrash metal song. And then you got the song City of God, which has some really melodic tremolo pick guitar lines. Among the B-sides, I really like the song No Captures. Starts off like a regular Sodom song, but then as the guitar solo comes in, there's some clean guitars and some whammy bar madness. And I'm just asking myself, what did this song do to get relegated to 8th in the track listing? Come on, Tom.
Also ursprünglich sollte ja die In the Sound of Evil sollte ein vollwertiges Album werden, damals 84. Aber die Plattenfirma hat uns dann erstmal nur mit 5 Stück abgespeist und hat gesagt, pass auf, wir warten erst mal ab, wie das läuft. Ne?
I know what you're thinking. Why are you reviewing some crappy, re-recording? Well, here's the thing. That's not entirely the case. So this is Sodom going back, finishing those songs and finally finishing their first proper debut album, 23 years after the fact. Procrastinate much? And instead of having the proper Sodom lineup of Bobby and Bernemann record this, Tom decided to bring back his old friends, Grey Violator and Chris Witchhunter, to record this album. Now, Tom made it very clear that this wasn't him doing a reunion with the members. They were basically just going to record this album and that's it. Essentially, Grey Violator and Witchhunter were acting as session musicians just for this project. Now, as far as the production goes, it's definitely a lot cleaner than the original EP. The playing is more tight. And I know some people like their metal raw and sloppy. And, some people prefer it to be more clean and articulate. Me personally, I don't really care too much. As long as the songs are good, then I'm good. And as far as the new songs, or at least, new to us Sodom listeners, they're old songs that they reworked, are kind of a mixed bag. Where Angels Die and Hatred of the Gods, to me, are just kind of whatever. But the album opener, Sin of Sodom, I think is pretty sick. Ashes to Ashes is pretty neat. But the best of the bunch is Bloody Corpse. I mean, come on. Why wasn't this on the original, 1984 EP? Unfortunately, while they were recording this album, Witchhunter was not in good health. He was suffering from illnesses related to alcoholism, and he had some difficulty during the recording sessions. He could often only go for about an hour or two a day, and if he did 2 hours in one day, he had to take the next day just completely off. He was able to finish the album, but sadly, shortly after they recorded it, he would pass away. The guy could be difficult to work with, difficult to get along with, but he was a drumming legend. He was doing the drumming equivalent of breaking the sound barrier, you know, going at the tempos he was going at. And I think that Witchhunter's story is actually somewhat inspiring in the sense that he really had to work to get as good as he was. Like, he wasn't some drumming prodigy. While Witchhunter's talent was definitely evident at first, it was unrefined. So he had to keep working, keep honing his craft, and then he was able to get to his technical peak on, like, the album Tap in the Vein. And on that album, his playing is tighter than the bond between me and my kitty cat. Yeah, you people thought I was going to say something dirty, didn't you? You people are all sexual deviants. But enough about the past. It was time for the proper Sodom lineup to get back to business.
I want to keep the spirit of heavy metal, and I'm a heavy metal fan, and the only difference between me and the audience is that I am standing 1 meter higher on the stage making music.
We are now on our 5th Sodom album without a lineup change. Even though technically it did change for the last album, but that doesn't count, right? That was just a one-time fling. And I gotta say, the first half of this album is incredible. Guitar tone is unleashed. It is satisfyingly crunchy, as it should be. And this album does have a more modern production, but I don't think it sounds overproduced. Like, I think this is an album that a fan of, like, old school Sodom could definitely get into, because it sounds great and the songs rip. I think this album might actually be Bernemann's best work as far as lead guitar solo goes. Like, you got some great solos on Nothing Counts More Than Blood and Through Toxic Veins. I also think Bobby's drums sound really good. Like, on some of the band's latter-day output, the drums can kind of sound a bit too compressed. But on this record, they actually sound like they're being played by a human being instead of friggin' ChatGPT. Although I will concede that the second half of this album falls off harder than Obituary after their first 2 albums. Yeah, I said it. I mean, you know, I guess it's not too bad, but, you know, you got songs like Canarenhines, Soul Contraband, and The Art of Killing Poetry, which to me are just kind of whatever. Although I will admit, the very polite song title of God Bless You, that song is actually pretty decent on the B-side. But as we know, we're talking about Sodom. You can't go too long without a lineup change. Although this time it wouldn't be the guitar player, it would actually be the drummer, Bobby. He would leave the band, and he would be succeeded by fellow one-name percussionist, Makka.
It's a really good album. I think it's a really good production. With a new drummer, you know, that's the most important thing to say, you know. It's a difference between War and Peace and a new one, you know.
I'll be honest, I'm not really a big fan of this album. I think it's kind of mediocre overall. Definitely a step down from In War and Pieces. I think if, you know, this album was playing in the background, you'd be like, yeah, this is alright, this is decent. But when you spend time with the album one-on-one, then it's just kind of meh. The album opener, My Final Bullet, is alright. But one funny thing about this album is that on the title track, Epitome of Torture, Tom actually pronounces it as Epitome of Torture, which I'm not really sure why he did that. I don't know if that was a, you know, translation error because English is a second language, or maybe epitome just has too many syllables and he just said it epitome just so he could get the vocal line to fit. But I think the second half of the album is actually better than the first half. The second to last song, Into the Skies of War, for whatever reason, is placed second to last in the track listing, which I think is typically reserved for like the worst song on the album. But I think it's actually one of the strongest on the album. I could see this song being something released off of like M16 or something like that. But my favorite of the B-sides is Shoot Today, Kill Tomorrow. You know, it's fast, it's thrashy, Angelripper's voice is hellish. And I love that line in the chorus, shoot today, kill tomorrow, one man's gun is another man's sorrow.
But the endless white rage just smoke like a waving shade. I know that they could not escape.
But I'm so happy with it, that people say Sodom are back, We always been in the scene, we never been back, but this album is going to be really straight and it seems to be really strong,
We are so back. Decision Day is absolutely an improvement upon Epitome of Torture, because we actually got some pretty memorable songs, even if the production does sound super compressed in my opinion. I think Sodom is one of those bands that they do best when they sound unhinged. Like they're let loose. Not necessarily sloppy, but just kind of raw and noisy. And one thing I don't understand about Sodom is that in 2014, they released an EP called Sacred Warpath, which obviously featured the song Sacred Warpath, which would go on to feature in this album. And just like any good kind of death thrash, 80s album would be, this EP, it sounded drenched in reverb. It's like, yes, this is what we want. This is how you can get a good sound with modern production. But then on the album version, they just totally yanked the reverb out of there. And the guitars on this album sound like they're reined in, and the drums sound like they're friggin' sampled. And this wouldn't be a one-time thing. They would catfish us with reverb again. In 2019, they released Genesis 19 on an EP. Genesis 19 would be the next album. And once again, you have a really cool reverby sound, and then on the album, they just totally yank the reverb out, completely pull the rug out on it like a crypto scammer. Now, while the production kind of blows, these songs are actually some of the most, inspired Sodom songs that they've written in a while. I love the chorus on the title track. I think it does a really good job of kind of portraying the anxiety of a soldier waiting for the ramp to go down. But the highlight for me is the almighty Rolling Thunder, which has got the best riffs on the album. Overall, I'd say this album is actually pretty melodic for Sodom. A lot of these songs either have clean or acoustic guitar elements throughout, which I think is cool. And this album just steamrolls you with bangers. Bloodlines, Refuse to Die, Sacred Warpath, and another one of my favorites, Strange Lost World. And we are now at the part of the Sodom video where there is another lineup change. This time, both drummer Makka and guitarist Bernemann would leave the band. And funny thing about Bernemann, he's not really seen as the classic Sodom guitar player. I would think Frank Blackfire or Grey Violator are. But he was in the band for 20 years. He's the longest tenured Sodom member outside of Angelripper himself. Makka would be replaced by drummer Toni Merkel, and Bernemann would be replaced by two guitar players, Yorck Segatz, and the return of an old friend, Frank Blackfire. That is right. The guitarist from Agent Orange and Persecution Mania is back in Sodom, and they went from a 3-piece to a 4-piece band. Now that they've got an extra member, let's see what they can do with them.
We also have a new drummer, Toni. It's a completely new lineup. It's a completely new album. This has nothing to do with Decision Day. I think the new album is more, it's more a typical Sodom album than Decision Day.
I believe Sodom was working on some material around 2020, but then when lockdown started and their touring plans got canceled, they decided, you know what, let's just hunker down, write some more songs, and finish this album. And what an album it turned out to be. I think the production is a bit more noisy. I don't want to say that it sounds raw, but it's definitely not as compressed as the last one. The guitars are crunchy, and the drums actually sound like drums. The songs definitely have a more retro feel. At the very least, they have that ethos of In the Sign of Evil or Obsessed by Cruelty, in the sense of pushing the pace and being aggressive. Especially on tracks like Dehumanize, Friendly Fire, and Nicht mehr mein Land. where they have straight up blast beats in the songs. But you also got tracks like The Harpooner, which has some doomy riffs. Indoctrination is like the punky sounding song on the album. But my favorite song on the album is the song about all the youth in the eastern hemisphere of the world. Euthanasia. Frank Blackfire knows how to write a song or two. And to put something out of this quality, like 36 years after your debut album, just goes to show, you know, the enduring quality of Sodom's music. But for their next album, would they still be able to keep it up? Or would they need the help with some Viagra?
That's the basic. So we have three composers, you know. You know, Frank is always has Agent Orange style thrash metal riffs, you know. Yorck is coming more from epic metal, you know. He loves all the British heavy metal bands from the 80s, you know. Yeah. And Toni is coming from a black and death metal scene. So we put everything together, and that makes the songs and the complete album so colorful, you know.
The latest release actually came out yesterday, June 27. I'm recording this June 28th. But I have listened to this album at least 3 times over, and I gotta say so far that I feel like it's just pretty mediocre, maybe even a step below that. I mean, even when the first single came out, Trigger Discipline, I just remember listening to that song and thinking, it's alright. Once again on this album, I feel like the sound is just a little bit too polished for my liking. The drums especially remind me of that really sampled sound that they had on Decision Day, which I find extra puzzling because it was the drummer who produced this album and also had a hand in mixing it as well. And as far as the songs themselves go, I mean, the album does start off decent enough with Battle of Harvest Moon. You also got the track Witchhunter, which is a tribute to the late and great Sodom drummer of the same name. But overall, I feel like these songs just kind of leave me wanting more. Like, I feel like these songs just kind of happen, and then they're over. I think the second half of the album is actually slightly better than the first half. The third single, Tapophobia, which is the fear of being buried alive, it's actually a pretty good song, might possibly be the best song on the album. But thankfully it does close out with a couple of good songs, Obliteration of the Eons and Return to God in Parts. So why is Sodom one of the most underrated yet simultaneously great thrash metal bands? Peak and longevity. I mean, quite frankly, I think they have something in their discography for every kind of metalhead. You know, if you're more into mainstream kind of metal, you know, like Metallica and Megadeth or whatnot, I think you could get into like their M16 and Agent Orange albums. Or if you're someone like myself who listens to stuff that's a bit more extreme, then you have In the Sign of Evil and Tapping the Vein. They pioneered black metal with their first 2 releases, helped codify the sound of thrash metal in the late 80s, helped pioneer the sound of death metal in the early 90s, and in the 25 years since the turn of millennium, they are still cranking out inspired thrash metal songs. So it is that combination of peak and longevity that makes Sodom one of the greatest thrash metal bands of all time.
Subscribe to the Downfall Network.
No!